Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into one of America's most unforgiving wilderness areas with 8 harrowing accounts from the Appalachian Trail that have remained buried in official reports and witness testimonies for far too long. These are not campfire tales or folklore passed down through generations. These are documented encounters from search and rescue coordinators, park rangers, experienced hikers and researchers who found themselves face to face with something far more sinister than the natural dangers of the mountains. From unexplained disappearances that defy logical explanation to predators who use the isolation of the wilderness to hunt their prey. Tonight we explore the darkest corners of America's most famous hiking trail. Each story has been reconstructed from official incident reports, witness statements, and survivor testimonies gathered from across the Appalachian region spanning from Georgia to Maine. While we have verified the core facts of each account through multiple sources, some names and specific locations have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved and to prevent interference with ongoing investigations. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for weekly deep dives into true horror stories that law enforcement and park services would prefer remain classified. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next buried case file that someone hoped would stay hidden forever. The doctors say I have severe PTSD. But that does not explain the 7 missing days in my memory or why I woke up 40 miles from where I started with wounds that should not exist. I am Marcus Rivera, 29 years old, and I have been a search and rescue coordinator for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for the past 6 years. My job is to find people who get lost in these mountains, not to become one of them. What happened to me in October of last year has shattered everything I thought I knew about these wilderness areas, and more importantly, what might be living in the places we never search. I had been coordinating rescue operations for almost a week straight, 3 separate incidents involving lost hikers, all within a 10-mile radius of the Appalachian Trail near Cades Cove. The pattern bothered me because it was unusual for so many people to get disoriented in the same general area, especially experienced hikers who knew the terrain. The last case involved a 34-year-old man named David Chen, who had been hiking alone for 2 days before his family reported him overdue. His abandoned campsite was found with all his gear intact, his tent properly secured, and his food still hanging in a bear bag 15 feet off the ground. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what direction he might have gone. It was like he had simply vanished between setting up camp and morning. That Thursday morning in late October, I decided to conduct my own search in the area where all 3 disappearances had occurred. I packed my standard emergency gear, GPS unit, radio, first aid kit, and enough supplies for 2 days. The weather forecast showed clear skies with temperatures dropping to the low 40s at night, perfect hiking conditions. I left the ranger station at 6:30 in the morning and drove to the Elkmont trailhead, planning to cover a grid pattern that would take me through the last known locations of all 3 missing persons. The first day of searching went exactly as expected. I covered approximately 12 miles of challenging terrain, documented several potential hazards like loose rock formations and unstable creek crossings, and radioed in status reports every 2 hours as required by department protocol. I found nothing unusual except for what appeared to be an old hunting blind about 3 miles off the main trail, constructed from natural materials and camouflaged so well that I almost missed it entirely. The construction was professional, with properly angled supports and weatherproofing that suggested someone had spent considerable time and effort building it. What struck me as odd was its location, deep in an area where hunting had been prohibited for over 20 years. I made camp that evening near Porter's Creek, following all the standard backcountry regulations. I secured my food properly, set up my tent on level ground away from potential rockfall areas, and conducted a final radio check at 8:15 p.m. The dispatcher confirmed clear reception and logged my position coordinates. That was my last memory for 7 days. The next thing I remember with any clarity is waking up on a narrow ridge approximately 40 miles northeast of where I had made camp, lying face down in a pile of wet leaves with my head pounding and my entire body feeling like I had been hit by a truck. My hiking boots were missing. My jacket was torn in multiple places. Most disturbing of all, I was wearing a wool sweater that did not belong to me. Dark green with a cable knit pattern, at least 2 sizes too large. The fabric smelled like wood smoke and something else I could not identify. Something organic and unpleasant. When I tried to stand, I discovered that both of my ankles were severely bruised and swollen. My left shoulder had been dislocated and inexpertly reset, leaving my arm nearly useless. I had scratches and cuts covering most of my exposed skin, some fresh and still bleeding. Others partially healed as if they were several days old. The most unsettling discovery was a series of small puncture wounds on my forearms, perfectly round and evenly spaced, like someone had been testing the sharpness of a knife or other pointed instrument. My backpack was missing, along with all my emergency supplies, radio, and GPS unit. I had no way to determine exactly where I was or how to get back to a main trail. The terrain was unfamiliar despite my extensive knowledge of the park boundaries. I was looking at rock formations and tree patterns I had never seen before in 6 years of working these mountains. The vegetation was different too, with species of ferns and mosses that seemed out of place for the elevation and climate zone. I spent the next 6 hours limping through dense forest, following what appeared to be animal trails that occasionally widened into something resembling old logging roads. I was severely dehydrated and increasingly disoriented when I finally heard voices in the distance. A group of day hikers found me stumbling along a creek bed about 2 miles from the Cosby campground, wearing that oversized sweater and a pair of canvas pants that were also not mine. They said I looked like I had been living in the woods for weeks. The paramedics who treated me at the scene documented injuries consistent with prolonged exposure and physical trauma. My core body temperature was dangerously low. I was dehydrated to the point of kidney stress. The puncture wounds on my arms showed signs of infection, and I had lost nearly 15 pounds. Blood tests revealed traces of a sedative compound that the doctors could not identify, something plant-based that was not in any of their standard reference materials. The most disturbing revelation came when I was being processed at the hospital. According to Park Service records, I had been reported missing on Friday morning when I failed to check in as scheduled. A massive search operation involving over 40 personnel, helicopters, and tracking dogs had been conducted for 6 days. They had found my abandoned vehicle at the Elkmont trailhead and discovered my campsite exactly where I had left it, but with one crucial difference. My tent had been collapsed and packed away as if I had broken camp normally. My food was no longer hanging in the bear bag, but stored properly in my backpack, which was sitting neatly beside the cold fire ring. The search teams had covered every square mile within a 20-mile radius of my last known position. They had followed every trail, checked every shelter, and investigated every possible route I might have taken. Not one person had found any trace of me or any indication of where I might have gone. According to the incident reports, it was as if I had simply ceased to exist for 7 days before reappearing 40 miles away in completely different clothing with injuries that made no medical sense. During my debriefing with park investigators, I was shown photographs of the items that had been left behind at my campsite. Among my carefully packed gear was a notebook I had never seen before, leather-bound with pages covered in handwriting that was definitely not mine. The text appeared to be some kind of observational log, with detailed descriptions of hiking patterns, weather conditions, and what the author referred to as harvest schedules. Most entries were dated from the past 3 months, all focusing on the same general area where the 3 hikers had disappeared. The notebook contained crude maps marking locations throughout the park, with symbols indicating various types of shelters or hiding places. One page had a detailed sketch of the hunting blind I had discovered on my first day, along with measurements and notes about capacity and seasonal usage. Another page contained a list of names including David Chen and the other 2 missing hikers, with dates and brief descriptions of their physical characteristics and hiking experience levels. The final entry in the notebook was dated the day before I disappeared. It contained a description of my daily search pattern, my radio check schedule, and an eerily accurate prediction of where I would make camp that night. At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, someone had written, "This one knows too much. Long-term storage required, useful for future operations." When I asked to examine the notebook more closely, the investigators told me it had been sent to FBI behavioral analysis specialists and was no longer available for review. They classified my case as a medical emergency with probable head injury causing amnesia, despite the fact that I showed no signs of traumatic brain injury and my cognitive functions were completely normal. The official incident report listed my disappearance as successful search and rescue operation and made no mention of the notebook, the unexplained injuries, or the fact that I had been found wearing someone else's clothes. I returned to work after a month of medical leave, but I was reassigned to office duties and prohibited from conducting field operations. My supervisor said it was temporary, just until I had fully recovered, but I could tell from his expression that he did not expect me to ever be cleared for backcountry work again. The 3 missing hikers were never found, and their cases were eventually classified as presumed fatalities due to wilderness accidents. I started having nightmares within a few weeks of returning to work. Always the same scenario. I am lying on a wooden floor in complete darkness, unable to move, while voices above me discuss logistics and timing. Sometimes I can smell that wood smoke and organic odor from the sweater. Sometimes I can feel those puncture wounds being made one by one while someone takes notes. I wake up with my heart racing and the absolute certainty that whatever happened to me during those 7 missing days is still happening to other people. 3 months after my incident, another experienced hiker disappeared from the same general area. This time it was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, a 31-year-old nurse from Knoxville who had been hiking alone for the weekend. Her campsite was found in perfect condition, with all her gear properly stored and her tent collapsed as if she had packed up normally. The search teams found no trace of her, and after 2 weeks her case was classified the same way as the others. I submitted a formal request to review all missing persons cases in the park from the past 5 years. My request was denied. I was told that such information was not relevant to my current duties, and that my continued focus on these cases was interfering with my ability to perform assigned tasks effectively. 2 weeks later, I was placed on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation. I am sharing this story now because I believe someone is systematically hunting people in these mountains, and the Park Service either does not want to acknowledge the pattern or they know about it and are choosing to cover it up. Those 7 missing days haunt me every night, not just because I cannot remember what happened, but because I am terrified I might remember eventually. And I am absolutely certain that whatever facility or operation I was held in is still out there, still active, still taking people who will never be found. The Appalachian Trail runs for over 2,000 miles through some of the most remote wilderness in North America. If someone wanted to disappear people permanently, they could not ask for a better hunting ground. I am sharing this because the families deserve to know the truth about what happened to the Appalachian youth group that disappeared in October 2019 and why I was the only one who came back. My name is Diana Kowalski. I am 34 years old, and I was an environmental scientist working for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation when I volunteered to lead what was supposed to be an educational hiking expedition for at-risk teenagers from Pittsburgh. What started as a 3-day wilderness therapy program turned into the worst nightmare imaginable. And 4 years later, I still wake up screaming about the choices I had to make to survive. The Appalachian Youth Group was a non-profit organization that worked with teenagers who had been in trouble with the juvenile justice system. The idea was to give these kids exposure to nature, teach them outdoor skills, and help them build confidence through controlled challenges in a wilderness setting. I had volunteered with the program twice before, leading day hikes and teaching basic ecology lessons. When they asked me to lead a 3-day backpacking trip in October, I jumped at the opportunity. These kids deserve to see something beautiful, to experience the kind of peace and clarity that only comes from being deep in the mountains. Our group consisted of 7 teenagers between the ages of 15 and 17, plus myself and Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old counselor who had been working with the program for 2 years. The kids were typical of the demographic the program served. Tough exteriors hiding deep insecurities, most from broken homes, all carrying more emotional baggage than any teenager should have to bear. There was Jamie Rodriguez, a 16-year-old girl who had been arrested for shoplifting but was actually one of the smartest kids I had ever met. Devin Mitchell, 17, who used humor to deflect from his anger issues but had genuine leadership potential. Sarah Kim, 15, quiet and observant, who had been caught vandalizing school property but was actually expressing her artistic talents in the wrong venue. The other 4 were Brandon Walsh, 16, whose parents had kicked him out for his drug use, but who was actually trying to get clean. Ashley Johnson, 17, who had been in 3 different foster homes and had trust issues with authority figures. Michael Torres, 15, who had been suspended for fighting but was actually protecting younger kids from bullies. And finally, Tyler Brown, 16, who had been stealing cars but was mechanically gifted and could fix anything with an engine. Despite their various legal troubles, they were good kids who had never been given a real chance to succeed. We started our hike on a Friday morning in mid-October from a trailhead in the Monongahela National Forest, planning to follow a well-marked section of the Appalachian Trail south for about 8 miles before setting up base camp in a designated wilderness area. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the 60s during the day and 40s at night, perfect conditions for backpacking. The kids were excited but trying not to show it, making jokes about survival shows and asking if we would have to eat bugs if we got lost. The first day went exactly according to plan. We covered the intended distance. The teenagers worked well together, helping each other with heavy packs and difficult terrain, and we made camp in a beautiful meadow surrounded by oak and maple trees in full autumn colors. Marcus had brought his guitar, and we spent the evening around the campfire sharing stories and teaching the kids basic wilderness skills like reading topographic maps and identifying edible plants. Everyone seemed to be having a genuinely good time, and I remember thinking this was exactly why programs like this were so important. The storm hit on Saturday morning without warning. The weather service had predicted scattered showers, but what rolled in was a full-scale autumn tempest with horizontal rain, wind gusts over 40 miles per hour, and temperatures that dropped 20 degrees in less than an hour. Our campsite, which had been perfectly sheltered the night before, suddenly became completely exposed to the elements. The kids' lightweight tents started collapsing, and it became clear that we needed to find better shelter immediately. Marcus and I made the decision to leave the established trail and head for a valley we could see about 2 miles to the east, where the terrain looked more protected and we might be able to wait out the worst of the storm. It was a reasonable decision based on the information we had. But it was also the moment everything started to go wrong. The valley was not marked on any of our topographic maps, which should have been our first warning sign. The terrain was rougher than it appeared from a distance, and the storm made navigation extremely difficult. By the time we reached the valley floor, we were all soaking wet, exhausted, and borderline hypothermic. The teenagers were scared but trying to stay brave, cracking jokes about being on a survival reality show and asking if there would be immunity challenges. We found what appeared to be an old hunting cabin tucked back in the trees, abandoned but structurally sound enough to provide shelter from the wind and rain. Marcus and I decided to wait out the storm there before attempting to return to the main trail. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that still drew properly. There were old supplies scattered around, rusted canned goods, moldy sleeping bags, and what appeared to be hunting equipment from decades past. Most disturbing were the personal items we found: hiking boots in various sizes, backpacks with name tags from different decades, and photographs of smiling hikers that had been tacked to the walls like trophies. Marcus and I exchanged worried glances but decided not to alarm the kids until we could figure out exactly what we were dealing with. The storm lasted for 2 full days, much longer than any weather service had predicted. Our radio could not pick up any signals in the valley, and our cell phones showed no service. We rationed our food carefully and kept the kids busy with games and survival lessons, but I could tell that Marcus was becoming increasingly concerned about our situation. On the second night, while the teenagers were sleeping, he showed me what he had found in the back room of the cabin. It was a journal, written in multiple handwritings spanning what appeared to be several decades. The entries described various groups of hikers who had taken shelter in the cabin over the years, most during severe weather events similar to what we were experiencing. The tone started friendly, with observations about the weather and descriptions of the people taking shelter. But as each journal progressed, the entries became darker, describing how food supplies dwindled, how the weather prevented leaving, and how difficult decisions had to be made for survival. The most recent entries were from 2003, describing a family of 4 who had become lost during an early winter storm. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, documenting the deaths of the parents and the difficult choices the remaining family members had to make to survive until spring. The final entry was dated 6 months later and simply said, "The valley provides for those who understand its rules. The weak feed the strong. This is the natural order." Marcus and I spent the rest of that night in whispered conversation, trying to figure out how to get the group out of the valley once the storm passed. But when morning came, we discovered that Devin Mitchell was missing from his sleeping bag. We searched the cabin thoroughly and found the back door open, leading to a narrow trail that wound deeper into the valley. The rain had stopped, but the trails were muddy and dangerous. Against my better judgment, we decided to follow the trail to look for Devin rather than leaving immediately. The trail led to what appeared to be the remains of an old mining operation, with several collapsed structures and rusted equipment scattered around a large clearing. We found Devin at the bottom of an old mine shaft, his neck broken from the fall. The teenagers were traumatized, and several of them wanted to know why the area was not marked on our maps and why there were no safety barriers around such obvious hazards. Marcus climbed down to recover Devin's body while I tried to keep the remaining 6 kids calm and focused on getting out of the valley. That afternoon, while we were preparing to leave, Sarah Kim disappeared. One moment she was helping pack gear, and the next moment she was gone. We found her packed by the creek, but there was no sign of struggle and no indication of which direction she might have gone. Brandon Walsh volunteered to search the area around the mining structures while the rest of us followed the creek downstream. We never found Brandon either. By the fourth day, our food supplies were nearly exhausted, and I was starting to understand why the journal entries had become so dark. The valley seemed designed to trap people, with steep walls on all sides and no clear exit routes. Every trail we followed either led to dead ends or circled back to the cabin. The teenagers were beginning to panic, and Marcus was showing signs of severe stress. When Ashley Johnson disappeared that night, I realized that something was systematically picking off members of our group. The next morning, Marcus suggested that we needed to start making hard choices about food rationing and survival priorities. He said that some of us were stronger and more likely to survive than others, and that we needed to be realistic about our situation. When I saw the look in his eyes, I knew he had read more of that journal than he had told me. That night, I stayed awake and watched him carefully. Around midnight, I saw him slip something into Tyler Brown's water bottle. I realized then that the journal had not been written by stranded hikers making desperate survival choices. It had been written by someone who was deliberately trapping people in the valley and documenting their systematic elimination. Marcus had been selected by whoever controlled this place, just as others had been selected before him. The valley was not just trapping us accidentally. It was being used as a hunting preserve where human predators could test their skills against groups of victims who could not escape. I killed Marcus Thompson with a rock while he slept, crushing his skull to prevent him from drugging any more of the teenagers. Jamie Rodriguez and Michael Torres were the only kids left alive by then, and I told them we were leaving the valley that morning no matter what it took. We followed the creek upstream until we found a route up the valley wall that was steep but climbable. It took us 6 hours to reach the rim, but we made it out. The official report listed the incident as a tragic hiking accident caused by severe weather and difficult terrain. 5 teenagers and 1 adult counselor died from exposure and falls in unmapped wilderness area. I was praised for saving 2 lives under impossible circumstances. The valley was never investigated, and I was told that the terrain was too dangerous for recovery operations. I quit my job with the state and moved to Oregon, where I work as a freelance environmental consultant. But I still have nightmares about that journal and the realization that there are places in our wilderness areas where human monsters use the isolation to hunt other humans for sport. And sometimes I wonder how many other valleys like that one exist in the remote sections of the Appalachian Trail, waiting for the next group of victims to seek shelter from a storm. After 35 years of law enforcement, I thought I had seen everything. I moved to the Virginia Blue Ridge for peace and quiet. Instead, I found something that has been hunting hikers for longer than anyone realizes. My name is Vincent Nakamura. I am 61 years old and I am a retired police detective from Sacramento, California. I came to the Shenandoah Valley in 2018 to enjoy my retirement, maybe do some hiking and get away from the urban violence that had consumed most of my career. What I discovered in these mountains made my worst homicide cases look like parking violations. I bought a small cabin about 3 miles outside of Front Royal, Virginia, right on the edge of the Shenandoah National Park. The property had been on the market for 2 years because it was considered too isolated for most buyers, but isolation was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin sat on 12 acres of heavily forested land, with a creek running through the back portion of the property. The Appalachian Trail passed within half a mile of my back fence line, and I could hear hikers talking and laughing as they passed by during the busy season. For the first 6 months, retirement was everything I had hoped it would be. I spent my mornings drinking coffee on the front porch, listening to the birds and watching deer graze in my front yard. I took up woodworking, started reading books again, and began exploring the network of hiking trails that crisscrossed the Blue Ridge Mountains. The local community was friendly but respected privacy, and I felt more relaxed than I had in decades. The The first sign that something was wrong came in early spring of 2019, when I started noticing patterns in the missing persons reports that were published in the local newspaper. The Front Royal Gazette ran a weekly public safety section that included summaries of police calls and Park Service incidents. Mostly routine stuff like fender benders and noise complaints. But over the course of 3 months, I counted 7 separate reports of hikers who had failed to return from planned trips on the Appalachian Trail. 7 missing hikers in 3 months seemed like an unusually high number for a relatively small section of trail, especially since most of the disappearances involved experienced hikers who were familiar with the terrain. As a retired detective, I could not help but notice patterns that others might miss. All 7 hikers had been traveling alone. All 7 had been reported missing during weekdays when trail traffic was relatively light. And all 7 had last been seen in roughly the same 10-mile section of trail that ran through some of the most remote wilderness in the park. I started keeping my own file on these disappearances, cutting out newspaper articles and tracking down additional information through contacts I still had in law enforcement. What I learned made my instincts start screaming. The Park Service had conducted extensive search operations for each missing hiker, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and dozens of trained personnel. Despite covering thousands of acres and following every possible route, they had found no trace of any of the missing persons. No abandoned equipment, no clothing, no human remains. 7 experienced hikers had simply vanished without leaving any evidence of what had happened to them. The breakthrough came in May 2019 when I was hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail myself and decided to explore some of the side trails that branched off into the deeper wilderness. About 4 miles from the main trail, I discovered what appeared to be a hunting camp tucked into a narrow valley that was completely hidden from any established hiking route. The camp consisted of several permanent structures built from natural materials, including a large cabin, what looked like storage buildings, and a series of smaller outbuildings that I could not immediately identify. The construction was professional quality with proper foundations, weatherproofing, and even what appeared to be a solar power system partially concealed under camouflage netting. This was not some temporary hunting camp or wilderness survival shelter. Someone had invested significant time, money, and effort into creating a permanent facility deep in protected wilderness where no development was supposed to exist. I observed the camp from a concealed position for several hours, using binoculars to document the layout and look for signs of current occupation. The place appeared deserted, but something about it felt wrong in a way that triggered every instinct I had developed during 3 decades of police work. The outbuildings were positioned in a defensive pattern with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest. This was the kind of setup you would expect to find in a military compound or a drug operation, not a hunting camp. When I was confident that nobody was around, I moved closer to investigate. The main cabin was unlocked, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. The interior was set up like a command center, with topographical maps covering one entire wall, marked with colored pins and notes written in a tight, precise handwriting. The maps showed the entire Appalachian Trail corridor through Virginia with detailed annotations about hiking patterns, seasonal traffic, and what appeared to be optimal locations for intercepting solitary hikers. One wall contained dozens of photographs, all showing hikers on various sections of the trail. The photos had been taken with a telephoto lens from concealed positions, and each one was labeled with a date, time, and detailed physical description of the subject. Some photos showed the same hikers over multiple days, as if someone had been following their progress along the trail and documenting their movements. Many of the faces in the photographs matched missing persons reports I had collected from local newspapers. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed journal that documented what the author called harvesting operations going back over 15 years. The entries were written in the same precise handwriting as the map annotations, and they described a systematic program of stalking and capturing solitary hikers. The journal contained detailed profiles of victims, including their hiking experience, physical condition, equipment, and estimated survival capabilities. Each entry concluded with clinical notes about disposal methods and lessons learned for future operations. According to the journal, the author had been living in these mountains for over 2 decades, initially as a survivalist trying to get away from civilization. Over time, he had developed what he called a natural management system for controlling the hiker population on his territory. He considered himself the guardian of this particular section of wilderness, responsible for maintaining the proper balance between human intrusion and natural order. Solitary hikers who entered his domain without permission were subject to what he called natural selection enforcement. The journal entries described in horrifying detail how victims were captured using various methods, from simple pit traps disguised as natural hazards to more sophisticated techniques involving staged emergencies or false trail markers that led people into dead-end ravines. Once captured, victims were held in underground facilities that had been constructed beneath the main compound, where they were systematically studied before being eliminated. The author seemed particularly interested in testing human survival capabilities under controlled conditions, documenting how long people could survive with limited food, water, and shelter. I photographed every page of the journal, every map notation, and every photograph on the walls before getting out of that compound as quickly as possible. Back at my cabin, I spent the rest of the night going through the evidence and trying to process what I had discovered. This was not just a serial killer operating in the wilderness. This was someone who had turned a section of the Appalachian Trail into his personal hunting preserve, where he had been systematically murdering hikers for over 15 years without anyone noticing the pattern. The next morning, I drove to the Virginia State Police headquarters in Culpeper and requested a meeting with the detective division. I brought copies of all the evidence I had collected, along with my analysis of the missing persons pattern and the location coordinates for the hidden compound. The detective who interviewed me was professional but skeptical, pointing out that I was a retired out-of-state officer with no jurisdiction in Virginia, and that what I was describing sounded like something from a horror movie. However, when I showed them the photographs and journal entries, their attitude changed completely. Within 2 hours, I was meeting with a joint task force that included state police detectives, FBI agents, and Park Service investigators. They had been aware that the number of missing hikers in the area was statistically unusual, but they had not connected the disappearances to a single perpetrator operating from a permanent base. The raid on the compound was conducted 3 days later by a heavily armed tactical team. They found the facility exactly as I had described it, but it was completely abandoned. All the maps, photographs, and journals had been removed, along with any other evidence of the operation. However, the underground facilities that the journal had described were still there, carved into the bedrock beneath the main cabin with sophisticated ventilation and drainage systems. The underground complex consisted of 6 separate chambers, each approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with heavy steel doors and electronic locking systems powered by the solar array. The chambers contained evidence of long-term human habitation, including makeshift beds, waste facilities, and what appeared to be observation equipment. Forensic analysis found DNA evidence from at least 12 different individuals, including several people who matched missing persons reports from the past 5 years. The investigation team also discovered a network of hidden trails and observation posts throughout a 20-square-mile area, all connected by buried communication cables and monitored by concealed cameras. The entire system had been designed to track and intercept hikers over a large section of the Appalachian Trail corridor, creating what amounted to a high-tech hunting preserve where victims could be selected and captured without anyone noticing they were missing until it was too late. Despite the extensive evidence and the recovery of human remains from several locations around the compound, the person responsible for these crimes was never found. The investigation team believed that he had been monitoring law enforcement communications and had abandoned his operation before the raid could be conducted. They also suspected that he had backup facilities in other remote locations, possibly in different states, where he could continue his activities. The compound was dismantled and the underground chambers were sealed, but the case remains officially open. The FBI task force continues to monitor missing persons reports along the entire Appalachian Trail corridor, looking for patterns that might indicate the perpetrator has resumed operations elsewhere. They have also implemented new safety protocols for hikers, including mandatory check-in procedures for anyone planning to hike alone in remote wilderness areas. I still live in my cabin near Front Royal, but I no longer hike alone, and I keep detailed records of all suspicious activity in the area. Sometimes at night when the wind is blowing through the trees and I can hear hikers talking on the distant trail, I wonder if he is still out there somewhere watching and waiting for the right opportunity to resume his harvest operations. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles through some of the most remote wilderness in America, and there are thousands of places where someone could build another compound without ever being detected. What terrifies me most is the realization that this individual had been operating successfully for over 15 years without anyone noticing the pattern. How many other predators might be using our wilderness areas as hunting grounds, taking advantage of the isolation and the assumption that people who disappear in the mountains have simply fallen victim to natural hazards? The mountains are full of secrets, and some of them are more dangerous than any wild animal. I started my Instagram account to document beautiful places across America. The Appalachian Trail was supposed to be content for my adventure series. I never posted about what I found above the fog line, and I never will. My name is Keisha Washington. I am 26 years old and I was a travel blogger from Atlanta, Georgia, with over 100,000 followers who trusted me to show them the most amazing outdoor destinations in the country. What happened to me in the Tennessee section of the Appalachian Trail last September has convinced me that there are places in our wilderness where the normal rules of reality simply do not apply. I had been building my brand as an adventure travel influencer for 3 years, focusing on solo female hiking and camping content that encouraged other women to get outdoors. My followers loved the combination of stunning photography, practical hiking advice, and honest discussions about the challenges of exploring remote places as a woman traveling alone. The Appalachian Trail had been on my content calendar for months, and I had planned a week-long solo hiking trip through the Great Smoky Mountains to create material for a series of posts about conquering fears and pushing personal boundaries. My plan was to start at Newfound Gap and hike north for about 40 miles over 5 days, documenting the changing fall colors and sharing daily updates about the challenges and rewards of long-distance hiking. I had invested heavily in professional camera equipment, including a drone for aerial shots, and I was carrying enough battery packs and memory cards to document every aspect of the experience. This was supposed to be the content series that would push my follower count over 150,000 and attract the kind of sponsorship deals that would let me turn travel blogging into a full-time career. The first 2 days went exactly according to plan. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and temperatures in the 70s during the day and 40s at night. The fall foliage was at peak color, providing the kind of dramatic landscape shots that performed well on social media. I was averaging about 12 miles per day, which gave me plenty of time to set up shots, write captions, and upload content during the evening hours when I had cell service at higher elevations. My followers were loving the series. Each post was getting thousands of likes and hundreds of comments from people saying the photos were inspiring them to plan their own hiking adventures. Several outdoor gear companies had reached out about potential partnerships, and I was already planning follow-up trips to other sections of the trail. Everything was going perfectly until the morning of day 3 when I encountered something that completely changed my understanding of what was possible in these mountains. I had camped the previous night at a designated backcountry site near Klingman's Dome, and I started hiking before sunrise to capture some dramatic shots of the dawn, light filtering through the forest canopy. The trail was clearly marked and well-maintained, following a ridgeline that offered spectacular views of the surrounding valleys. About 2 hours into my hike, as the morning mist started to burn off, I noticed that I was approaching what appeared to be a solid wall of fog that stretched across the entire mountainside. The fog line was perfectly horizontal, as if someone had drawn a line across the landscape at exactly 4,500 feet elevation. Below the line, the morning was clear and bright, with unlimited visibility in all directions. Above the line, the fog was so thick that I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. I had encountered mountain fog before, but nothing like this. The boundary between clear air and complete obscurity was so sharp and defined that it looked artificial. I decided to hike up into the fog to get some atmospheric shots for my content series. Fog can create incredibly dramatic photography conditions, and I thought my followers would love to see the contrast between the clear views below and the mysterious conditions above. I switched my camera to manual focus and started documenting my ascent into what I assumed was just an unusual weather phenomenon. The moment I crossed the fog line, everything changed. The temperature dropped by at least 20 degrees instantly, and the air became thick and humid in a way that made breathing difficult. More disturbing, the fog seemed to muffle sound in an unnatural way. I could no longer hear birds singing, insects buzzing, or even the sound of my own footsteps on the trail. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and the sound of blood flowing through my ears. My GPS unit immediately lost signal, which was unusual because I was still on a high ridgeline with clear sky above the fog layer. My phone showed no service, even though I had been getting strong signals just minutes before. Most disturbing of all, my compass started spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. I had been hiking for years and had never encountered conditions that could affect multiple navigation instruments simultaneously. I decided to continue hiking for a few more minutes to see if the conditions would improve, but instead they became increasingly strange. The trail, which had been clearly marked and well maintained below the fog line, started to become overgrown and difficult to follow. The white blazes that marked the Appalachian Trail seemed to fade and disappear, replaced by blazes of different colors that I did not recognize. Some were painted in faded red, others in blue or yellow, and they did not seem to follow any logical pattern or direction. After about 20 minutes of hiking in these conditions, I encountered another hiker coming from the opposite direction. This should have been reassuring, but instead it was deeply unsettling. The hiker was an elderly man wearing gear that looked like it was from the 1970s, including a heavy canvas backpack and leather hiking boots that had been out of style for decades. His clothes were clean and in good condition, but the styles were completely wrong for modern hiking gear. When I called out a greeting, he stopped and stared at me with a confused expression, as if he had never seen anyone dressed like me before. He asked me what year it was, which I thought was a strange joke until I realized he was completely serious. When I told him it was 2023, he became visibly upset and said that was impossible, because he had only been hiking for 2 days since leaving his car at the trailhead in 1978. He insisted that it was still October 1978 and that I was mistaken about the current date. I tried to show him my phone as proof of the current date, but he acted like he had never seen a smartphone before. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands and asking me how the screen could display moving pictures without being connected to a television. When I tried to explain digital technology, he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The conversation became increasingly surreal until he finally said he needed to continue hiking to meet his hiking partner who was waiting for him at a shelter that should have been reached hours ago. After he disappeared back into the fog, I tried to process what had just happened. Either I had encountered someone with severe mental health issues who was living some kind of elaborate fantasy, or something was seriously wrong with the conditions above the fog line. I decided to turn around and return to the clear area below, but when I tried to retrace my steps, I could not find the trail I had used to ascend into the fog. I spent the next several hours wandering through the fog, trying to find a way back down to the clear area below. Every direction I tried seemed to lead me deeper into the mountains, and the trails I followed kept branching and changing in ways that made no logical sense. I encountered 2 more hikers during this time, both of whom claimed to be from different decades and both of whom seemed genuinely confused about the current date and modern technology. One was a young woman who insisted it was 1985 and who was wearing bright neon hiking gear that looked like it had just come from the store. She was carrying a Walkman and kept asking me why my music player did not have a tape deck. The other was a middle-aged man who claimed it was 1992 and who became extremely agitated when I could not explain why I did not recognize the brand names on his equipment, all of which had apparently been discontinued decades ago. The most disturbing part of these encounters was that all 3 hikers seemed to be experiencing time normally from their own perspective. They claimed to have been hiking for only a few hours or days, and they showed no signs of having been lost in the wilderness for decades. Their gear was clean, their food supplies were fresh, and they appeared to be in good physical condition. It was as if time was moving differently for each person above the fog line, with everyone trapped in their own temporal bubble while experiencing the same physical space. By late afternoon, I was becoming seriously concerned about my ability to find my way back to the main trail. My camera equipment was draining batteries at an abnormal rate, and several of my electronic devices had stopped working entirely. The fog showed no signs of lifting, and I was starting to wonder if I would be able to find my way out before dark. That was when I encountered something that convinced me I needed to get out of this area by any means necessary. I was following what appeared to be a trail marker when I came across a small clearing where dozens of backpacks and pieces of hiking equipment were arranged in neat rows, as if someone had been collecting them for years. The equipment spanned multiple decades, from modern ultralight gear to heavy canvas packs that looked like they belonged in a museum. Many of the packs still contained personal items, driver licenses with photos of smiling hikers, journals with entries describing Appalachian Trail adventures, and photographs of families who were probably still wondering what had happened to their missing loved ones. In the center of the clearing was a notebook, similar to a trail register, where hikers traditionally sign in to record their passage. The entries in this notebook went back to 1962, with thousands of signatures from people who had apparently found this clearing over the past 60 years. The entries were written in dozens of different handwritings, but they all described the same experience: getting lost in fog above a certain elevation, encountering other hikers from different time periods, and being unable to find their way back to the main trail. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago, written by someone who claimed to have been wandering in the fog for what felt like weeks, but who insisted that his watch showed he had only been hiking for a few hours. He wrote that he had encountered hikers from every decade since the 1960s, all of whom were trapped in the same area and all of whom experienced time differently. The final line of his entry read, "I think this place collects people. I think it has been collecting people for a very long time." I ran from that clearing as fast as I could, crashing through underbrush and ignoring trail markers, driven by pure panic and the desperate need to get back to normal reality. I have no idea how long I ran or which direction I went, but eventually I broke through the fog line and found myself back in the clear area below. When I checked my phone, I discovered that I had been above the fog line for less than 3 hours, even though it had felt like an entire day. I hiked directly back to the nearest trailhead and drove straight home to Atlanta, abandoning my planned content series and never posting any of the footage I had captured above the fog line. When I reviewed the photos and videos later, most of the files were corrupted beyond recovery, showing only static or distorted images that made no sense. The few clear images I had managed to capture showed landscapes and trail markers that do not appear on any official Appalachian Trail maps. I never returned to that section of the trail, and I have never told anyone the full story of what happened above the fog line. But sometimes I search online for missing persons reports from the Appalachian Trail, and I recognize faces from driver licenses I saw in that clearing. People who disappeared decades ago and who their families probably assume died from exposure or falls, but who might still be wandering above the fog line, trapped in their own personal time loops and wondering why they cannot find their way home. There are places in our wilderness areas where the normal rules of physics and time do not seem to apply, and the Appalachian Trail passes through some of those places. If you ever encounter a perfectly horizontal fog line that seems to cut across an entire mountainside, do not cross it. Some boundaries are not meant to be explored, and some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. I test survival equipment for a living, so when the blizzard hit in March, I was not worried. I knew about the old CCC shelter. What I did not know was that someone else was already living there and they were not planning to share. My name is Tyler Brennan. I am 31 years old and I work as an outdoor gear tester for Wilderness Tech Solutions based out of Denver, Colorado. My job requires me to push equipment to its limits in some of the harshest conditions nature can offer. From desert heat to Arctic cold. I have spent nights in temperatures that would kill most people, testing gear that saves lives in emergency situations. Last March, I was conducting a week-long evaluation of new winter survival equipment in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. The assignment was to test a new line of emergency shelters and cold weather gear by spending several nights in abandoned civilian Conservation Corps shelters that dot the remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. These stone structures were built during the Great Depression by work crews who carved them into hillsides and constructed them to last for generations. Most hikers avoid them now because they are associated with ghost stories and urban legends, but they provide perfect conditions for testing how modern gear performs in primitive shelters. The weather forecast called for a moderate winter storm, exactly the kind of conditions I needed to properly evaluate the equipment. I plan to spend 3 nights in different CCC shelters documenting how the gear performed in temperatures ranging from 20 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The shelter I targeted for the second night was located about 8 miles off the main trail, accessible only by an unmarked path that required GPS navigation to find. The blizzard hit 6 hours ahead of schedule and with an intensity that made the forecast look like a joke. What was supposed to be 4 to 6 inches of snow turned into 18 inches with wind gusts over 50 miles per hour. By mid-afternoon, I was hiking through conditions that would have been dangerous even with a full rescue team on standby. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, and the temperature plummeted from 20 degrees to -5 in less than 2 hours. I reached the 300 shelter just as the storm reached its peak intensity, and I was relieved to find the heavy wooden door partially open. I pushed inside and immediately felt the temperature difference. The shelter was constructed from fitted fieldstone with a peaked roof that had been designed to shed snow and channel wind around the structure rather than through it. The interior was a single room about 12 feet by 16 feet, with stone benches built into the walls and a small fireplace in the corner that still had a functional chimney. What struck me immediately was that someone had been using the shelter recently. There was a neat stack of seasoned firewood by the entrance, far more than any casual hiker would have carried in. A thick wool blanket was folded on one of the stone benches along with a metal cup and a wooden bowl that looked hand-carved. Most telling were the fresh ashes in the fireplace and the faint smell of wood smoke that indicated a fire had been burning within the past few hours. I called out to announce my presence but received no response except the echo of my own voice off the stone walls. Assuming the occupant was out checking trap lines or gathering wood, I settled my gear on the opposite side of the shelter and began setting up my testing equipment. I started a small fire using some of the available wood, figuring I could replace it or compensate the owner when they returned. The shelter warmed quickly, and I spent the evening documenting how my gear performed in the controlled environment. The new sleeping bag maintained core body temperature effectively, and the emergency shelter components worked exactly as designed. I was pleased with the test results and looked forward to completing the evaluation over the next 2 days. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow outside. I grabbed my headlamp and cautiously opened the door, shining the beam into the storm. A figure emerged from the swirling snow, a man of medium height wearing multiple layers of wool clothing and carrying what appeared to be several dead rabbits slung over his shoulder. His face was mostly hidden by a thick beard and a knit cap pulled low over his eyes. He introduced himself simply as Eli and explained that this shelter had been his home for the past 3 winters. He was polite but wary, making it clear that he was not accustomed to sharing his space with strangers. However, he acknowledged that the storm was too dangerous for anyone to be traveling and agreed to let me stay the night provided I respected his territorial boundaries and did not interfere with his survival routines. Eli was clearly an experienced woodsman who had been living off the land for an extended period. He skinned and prepared the rabbits with practiced efficiency, using tools that he had obviously crafted himself. He shared some of the meat with me, cooked over the fire in a way that showed he had perfected the technique through necessity rather than recreation. His knowledge of the mountains was extensive, and he seemed to know every trail, creek, and landmark within a 20-mile radius. As the night progressed, our conversation revealed that Eli had been monitoring the area for signs of other people and had detailed knowledge of hiking patterns along the remote trails. He mentioned several hikers who had passed through the area over the past few months, describing their gear, their apparent experience levels, and their planned routes with unsettling accuracy. When I asked how he had gathered such detailed information, he explained that he maintained a network of observation posts throughout his territory and made it his business to know who was traveling through his domain. The next morning, I discovered that some of my gear had been moved during the night. My water bottles had been partially drained and my backup knife was missing from my pack. When I confronted Eli about this, he admitted to taking the knife but claimed it was a necessary precaution. He said he had learned to be suspicious of anyone who carried weapons in his territory, because armed strangers usually meant trouble for someone living as he did. The storm continued through the second day with no sign of letting up. Eli became increasingly agitated as the hours passed, frequently checking the door and windows as if expecting something dangerous to appear. He told me that severe weather often drove desperate people to do desperate things and that isolated shelters like this one attracted individuals who were fleeing from law enforcement or other dangerous situations. That afternoon, while Eli was outside checking his trap lines, I noticed additional items in the shelter that I had not seen before. There were several backpacks of different sizes and styles tucked behind one of the stone benches, along with hiking boots, water bottles, and other personal items that clearly belonged to different people. When I examined the items more closely, I found identification cards and wallets belonging to at least 4 different hikers, all with recent dates. When Eli returned, I confronted him about the items I had found. His demeanor changed completely, becoming hostile and defensive. He claimed that the items belonged to hikers who had stayed in the shelter over the past few years and had left things behind when they departed. However, his explanation did not account for the personal identification and valuable items that no hiker would abandon voluntarily. That evening, Eli's behavior became increasingly erratic. He blocked the door when I attempted to step outside, claiming that something was stalking the area and that it was too dangerous for anyone to leave the shelter. He insisted that several hikers had disappeared from this area over the past 2 years and that their bodies had never been found. When I pointed out that he seemed to know an unusual amount about these disappearances, he became aggressive and accused me of being an undercover law enforcement officer. On the 3rd morning, with the storm finally beginning to ease, I decided it was time to leave regardless of Eli's objections. I packed my gear quickly and headed for the door, but found it would not open. Eli was standing guard with my stolen knife in his hand, and he made it clear that he had no intention of letting me leave. He claimed that anyone who knew about his shelter and his activities was a threat to his survival, and that he could not allow me to report his presence to the authorities. I realized then that the items I had found belonged to hikers who had never left this shelter alive. Eli had been using the CCC shelter as a base for hunting human prey, taking advantage of severe weather conditions to trap victims who had no choice but to seek shelter. The rabbit traps around the perimeter were probably supplemented by more sophisticated devices designed to capture or disable people. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Eli was experienced with wilderness survival, but not with hand-to-hand combat. I managed to disarm him and secure the knife, but when I tried to open the door, I discovered it had been locked from the outside with some kind of mechanical device. We were both trapped inside the shelter, and someone else was controlling our situation. Through the small window, I could see a figure moving through the trees about 50 yards away. The person was wearing modern winter clothing and appeared to be observing the shelter through binoculars. When they realized I had seen them, they disappeared into the forest, but I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a radio or communication device in their hand. I spent the rest of that day trying to force the door and signal for help using my emergency beacon. My cell phone had no service, but I was able to send a GPS distress signal that included my exact coordinates and a message indicating I was being held against my will. I also used the fireplace to create smoke signals, hoping that someone would notice the unusual activity and investigate. Eli became increasingly panicked as he realized that his operation had been compromised. He admitted that he was not working alone, and that there were other people involved in what he called wilderness management activities. According to him, there was a network of individuals who used remote shelters and cabins throughout the Appalachian Mountains to intercept and eliminate hikers who posed security risks or who simply had the misfortune to encounter their operations. Late that evening, I heard vehicles approaching through the snow. A search and rescue team had responded to my emergency beacon and had followed my GPS coordinates to the shelter. They found the external locking mechanism and freed me from what had essentially become a prison. Eli had disappeared through what turned out to be a concealed exit in the back wall of the shelter, probably escaping through a tunnel system that connected to other locations in the area. The investigation that followed revealed that the CCC shelter had been modified extensively over the years, with hidden compartments, escape routes, and storage areas that were not part of the original construction. The authorities found evidence that multiple people had been held in the shelter against their will, including personal items belonging to at least 8 different hikers who had been reported missing over the past 3 years. The case remains under investigation by a joint task force that includes state police, the FBI, and Park Service law enforcement. They believe that there is an organized network operating throughout the remote areas of the Appalachian Trail, using isolated shelters and cabins to prey on solo hikers and small groups who would not be missed for days or weeks. The network appears to have been active for several years and may be responsible for dozens of disappearances that were previously attributed to natural causes or accidents. I returned to my job testing survival equipment, but I no longer work alone in remote areas, and I avoid any location that does not have reliable communication with the outside world. The experience taught me that the greatest dangers in wilderness areas are not always natural hazards like weather, terrain, or wild animals. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who have learned to use our wilderness areas as hunting grounds where they can operate without interference from law enforcement or witnesses. The Appalachian Trail passes through thousands of square miles of remote wilderness where a person could disappear without a trace. If you are planning to hike alone in isolated areas, make sure someone knows exactly where you will be and when you plan to return. And if you encounter any abandoned shelters or structures that show signs of recent modification or unusual activity, do not investigate alone. Some mysteries in the wilderness are too dangerous to solve without backup. I came to the Appalachians to study how sound travels through mountain valleys. My grant was to research natural acoustics. Instead, I discovered that some sounds in these mountains are not natural at all. My name is Dr. Amara Okafor. I am 38 years old, and I am an acoustic researcher specializing in environmental soundscapes at the University of Texas at Austin. I received a National Science Foundation grant to conduct a comprehensive study of acoustic phenomena in mountainous terrain, specifically focusing on how complex topography affects sound transmission and creates unique audio environments. The location I selected for my research was a remote valley in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, approximately 15 miles from the nearest marked trail. The valley was perfect for my study because it was completely enclosed by steep ridgelines that created natural amphitheater conditions, allowing me to document how sound waves bounced between different elevations and how various geological features influenced acoustic properties. I established a field research station in the valley bottom, complete with sensitive recording equipment, computer analysis systems, and a network of remote microphones positioned throughout the area. For the first 4 months, my research progressed exactly according to plan. I documented the natural soundscape of the valley throughout different seasons, recording everything from birdsong at dawn to the subtle sounds of nocturnal animals moving through the underbrush. I conducted controlled experiments using calibrated speakers placed at various elevations, measuring how sound intensity decreased with distance and how different frequencies were absorbed or reflected by the surrounding terrain. The data I was collecting was exactly what I needed to complete my doctoral thesis and potentially secure additional research funding. The first anomaly appeared in late October, buried in a routine overnight recording session. While reviewing audio files from the previous night, I detected a low-frequency hum that lasted for approximately 47 minutes, beginning just after midnight and ending abruptly at 12:47 a.m. The frequency was consistent at 28 Hz, well below the range of most natural environmental sounds, and it seemed to emanate from multiple locations simultaneously, rather than having a single point source. Initially, I assumed the sound was some form of mechanical noise, possibly from mining equipment or industrial activity in a neighboring valley. However, when I consulted topographical maps and contacted local authorities, I discovered that there were no active mining operations within 50 miles of my research site, and no industrial facilities that could generate the type of sustained low-frequency sound I had recorded. Over the next several weeks, the anomalous recordings became more frequent and more complex. In addition to the low-frequency hum, I began picking up what sounded like rhythmic tapping patterns, electronic interference that resembled digital communication signals, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be human voices speaking in fragments of different languages. The voices were always distant and distorted, as if they were being transmitted through multiple layers of electronic processing, but they were clearly articulating words and phrases in English, Spanish, German, and what might have been Russian or Eastern European languages. The pattern that emerged was deeply unsettling. The anomalous sounds only occurred between midnight and 3 a.m., always when atmospheric conditions were most stable and natural ambient noise was at its lowest. The voices seemed to be engaged in some form of communication, with different speakers responding to each other across time delays that suggested they were transmitting from various locations throughout the valley and possibly beyond. I expanded my monitoring network, placing additional microphones at higher elevations and using directional recording equipment to try to pinpoint the source of these transmissions. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about the acoustic properties of natural environments. The sounds were not originating from any single location, but were being generated by a sophisticated network of hidden audio devices that had been installed throughout the valley ecosystem. My breakthrough came during a systematic survey of the valley's eastern ridge, where my equipment had consistently detected the strongest signal sources. Camouflaged among the natural vegetation, I found a series of small electronic devices mounted on tree trunks approximately 8 feet above ground level. Each device was roughly the size of a paperback book, powered by solar panels that were nearly invisible among the leaves and connected to the others by thin cables that had been buried just below the soil surface. The devices were clearly professional-grade equipment, manufactured to military specifications and designed for long-term deployment in hostile environments. Each unit contained a small speaker, a sensitive microphone, and what appeared to be a digital processing system capable of receiving, modifying, and retransmitting audio signals. The network extended throughout the entire valley, with over 30 individual units working in coordination to create a comprehensive acoustic manipulation system. Following the buried cables led me to a much larger installation hidden beneath a dense stand of hemlock trees on the valley's northern slope. What I initially thought was a natural rock formation turned out to be a carefully camouflaged bunker, constructed from reinforced concrete and covered with years of accumulated forest debris. The entrance was concealed behind a section of artificial rock that swung open on hidden hinges when I accidentally activated a pressure switch while examining what I thought was a natural boulder. The interior of the bunker was a sophisticated command center containing banks of computers, audio processing equipment, and monitoring systems that were actively recording and analyzing acoustic data from throughout the Appalachian region. Multiple screens displayed real-time audio waveforms from hundreds of remote monitoring stations, creating a comprehensive map of sound activity across thousands of square miles of wilderness. The facility was clearly designed for long-term operation, with its own power generation system, climate control, and living quarters for at least 4 people. According to the documentation I found in the facility, this was one node in a larger network called Project Resonance, which had been conducting acoustic surveillance and psychological manipulation experiments in remote wilderness areas for over 8 years. The project appeared to be testing the effectiveness of infrasound, subsonic frequencies, and artificially generated audio phenomena in inducing disorientation, paranoia, and other psychological responses in human subjects who encountered the modified soundscapes. The target subjects were primarily solo hikers, hunters, and researchers who spent extended periods alone in remote areas where their psychological responses could be monitored without interference from other people. The project was documenting how various types of acoustic manipulation affected decision-making, spatial orientation, and emotional stability. Some experiments involved playing back recorded voices in foreign languages to induce paranoia about foreign surveillance. Others used subsonic frequencies that could cause feelings of unease or terror without the subject being consciously aware of any unusual sounds. Most disturbing were the psychological profiles of individual subjects who had been monitored over multiple visits to affected areas. The files contained detailed behavioral assessments of hundreds of people, including hikers who had reported strange experiences, paranormal encounters, or unexplained feelings of being watched while camping in supposedly isolated wilderness areas. The project had been systematically manipulating the acoustic environment of these locations to study how environmental stressors affected human psychology and decision-making under survival conditions. My own research had unknowingly made me a subject in their experiments. The facility contained a complete file on my activities, including copies of my grant application, photographs of my campsite taken from concealed cameras, and detailed analysis of my behavioral patterns over the 4 months I had been working in the valley. They had been using my presence to test how a trained scientist would respond to increasingly obvious anomalies in what should have been a natural environment. The psychological effects began almost immediately after I discovered the facility, even though I understood intellectually that the sounds I had been hearing were artificially generated. I started experiencing severe anxiety, insomnia, and auditory hallucinations. I would hear whispered conversations in my tent at night, electronic beeping sounds when no equipment was active, and the distinctive low-frequency hum even when I was away from the valley. The manipulation had been more effective than I realized, conditioning my nervous system to respond to acoustic triggers that continued to affect me even after I understood their artificial nature. When I attempted to document my findings and report the illegal surveillance operation to appropriate authorities, I encountered a series of bureaucratic obstacles that suggested the project had official protection at some level of government. My university supervisors advised me to abandon my research and relocate to a different field site, citing unspecified security concerns. My equipment began malfunctioning in ways that appeared to be deliberate sabotage rather than natural failures. The final warning came in the form of a midnight visit to my campsite by 2 individuals in civilian clothing who identified themselves only as federal contractors. They informed me that my continued presence in the area was compromising an ongoing national security operation, and that I would be held legally responsible for any disruption of authorized research activities. They provided me with a non-disclosure agreement that prohibited me from discussing my discoveries and offered a substantial financial settlement in exchange for my silence. I signed the agreement and left Pennsylvania the following morning, but the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of how our wilderness areas are being used by government agencies and private contractors. The acoustic manipulation techniques I discovered represent a sophisticated form of psychological warfare that is being tested on unsuspecting civilians who venture into remote areas where they expect to find only natural phenomena. Since leaving the valley, I have relocated to the Pacific Northwest, where I work as a freelance acoustic consultant for environmental organizations. However, I continue to monitor reports of strange acoustic phenomena in wilderness areas, and I have identified similar patterns of unexplained sounds in remote locations throughout the western United States. The network of acoustic manipulation facilities appears to be much larger than the single installation I discovered in Pennsylvania. The most disturbing aspect of this experience is the realization that our most remote and supposedly pristine wilderness areas may be thoroughly monitored and manipulated by technologies we never see or suspect. When hikers report hearing strange sounds, feeling inexplicably anxious in certain locations, or experiencing the sensation of being watched in supposedly isolated areas, they may not be imagining things or encountering supernatural phenomena. They may be unwitting subjects in psychological experiments designed to test the limits of human perception and mental stability. If you spend time hiking in remote wilderness areas, pay attention to sounds that seem out of place or create emotional responses that are not proportional to the actual stimulus. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about the acoustic environment of a particular location. And remember that not all the sounds you hear in the wilderness are as natural as they appear to be. Sometimes the forest is listening to you more closely than you are listening to it. And sometimes the most effective predators are the ones you never see, hear, or suspect are there. My grandfather guided hunters in these Kentucky mountains for 50 years. My father did it for 30. I was supposed to continue the tradition. After last hunting season, I will never set foot in those woods again. My name is Jasper McCallum. I am 42 years old and I moved here from Montana 15 years ago when I married my wife Emma, whose family had deep roots in eastern Kentucky. The McCallum name might not have been born in these mountains, but I learned every ridge, every creek, and every game trail like I had been walking them since childhood. When Emma's father passed away in 2018, I inherited his outfitting business along with his hunting guide's license and 23 years of client relationships. Appalachian Wilderness Guides had been operating out of the Daniel Boone National Forest since the 1990s, providing hunting expeditions for deer, elk, black bear, and wild turkey. We specialized in multi-day backcountry hunts where clients could experience the authentic mountain wilderness while pursuing game in some of the most remote and challenging terrain in Kentucky. The business was successful because I understood that city hunters needed more than just someone to show them where the animals were. They needed someone who could keep them safe in country that could kill an unprepared person in a dozen different ways. I knew which ridges were stable and which had loose shale that could send you tumbling into a ravine. I knew which hollows flooded during heavy rain and which creek crossings became impassable death traps when the water rose. Most importantly, I knew the difference between normal forest sounds and the sounds that meant something dangerous was moving through your area. Last October, I was hired by a group of 4 hunters from Louisville who wanted to pursue elk in the most remote section of the forest, about 20 miles from the nearest marked trail. The group consisted of 2 married couples in their 40s who had been hunting together for years, but had never attempted a backcountry expedition of this difficulty. Marcus and Patricia Chen were experienced deer hunters who wanted to challenge themselves with elk. David and Rebecca Morrison were newer to hunting but in excellent physical condition and eager to learn advanced techniques. We established base camp in a small meadow surrounded by dense hardwood forest, about 2 miles from a creek that provided fresh water and attracted game during the early morning and evening hours. The location was perfect for elk hunting because it provided multiple approach routes and escape paths, while being far enough from any human activity that the animals felt secure using the area for feeding and bedding. The first 3 days of the hunt went exactly according to plan. We spotted several small herds of elk and managed to position ourselves for multiple shot opportunities. Marcus successfully harvested a mature bull elk on the 2nd day, and David took a cow elk on the 3rd day. Both kills were clean and ethical, and the hunters were thrilled with their success. We spent the 4th day processing the meat and preparing it for transport, planning to hike out the following morning. That evening, while we were sitting around the campfire discussing the details of the hunt, Patricia mentioned that she had been hearing strange sounds during the night. She described them as whispered conversations in a language she did not recognize, coming from different directions around our campsite. When I asked for more specifics, she said the voices seemed to move in a circle around us, always staying just outside the range of our flashlights, and that they seemed to be discussing our group in a way that made her extremely uncomfortable. I told the group that remote wilderness areas often produce acoustic phenomena that can sound like human voices, especially when wind moves through rock formations or dense vegetation. I had heard similar reports from other clients over the years, and I attributed them to the psychological effects of spending time in unfamiliar and potentially dangerous environments. However, Patricia insisted that what she was hearing was definitely human speech, and that the speakers seemed to know details about our hunt and our personal lives that strangers could not possibly know. The next morning, we broke camp early and began the long hike back to our vehicles. The trail was difficult but well marked, and we made good time despite carrying heavy packs loaded with elk meat and hunting equipment. We stopped for lunch at a creek crossing about halfway to the trailhead, and that was when Rebecca Morrison disappeared. She had been walking third in our single-file line, directly behind her husband David and ahead of Patricia Chen. When we stopped to rest and eat, David turned around to hand Rebecca her water bottle and discovered that she was not there. We immediately backtracked along the trail, calling her name and searching for any sign of where she might have left the group. We found her backpack about a quarter-mile behind us, sitting neatly beside the trail as if she had placed it there deliberately. But there was no indication of which direction she had gone or why she had removed her pack. We spent the rest of that day and the entire following day conducting an intensive search of the area around where Rebecca had disappeared. I used every tracking technique I knew, following game trails, checking creek beds, and examining every possible route she might have taken. The other hunters spread out in a grid pattern, calling her name and listening for any response. We found no footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, and no indication that she had been attacked by a wild animal. On the second night of searching, Marcus Chen also disappeared. He had volunteered to take the first watch while the rest of us got some sleep, and when David woke up at 2 a.m. to relieve him, Marcus was gone. His rifle was still leaning against the tree where he had been sitting, and his coffee cup was still warm, indicating that he had vanished within minutes of David falling asleep. We were now down to 3 people in an area where 2 experienced adults had disappeared without leaving any trace. I made the decision to hike out immediately and contact the authorities rather than continuing to search with our depleted group. We packed only essential survival gear and began hiking toward the trailhead before dawn, moving as fast as the terrain would allow. During that forced march, I began to notice signs that we were being followed by someone or something that was staying parallel to our route, but remaining hidden in the dense forest. The sounds were subtle but consistent, the occasional snap of a twig under a heavy footstep, the rustle of vegetation that was moving against the wind direction, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like human voices conducting quiet conversations in the forest around us. The voices were too distant and muffled to understand individual words, but the rhythm and tone were definitely human speech rather than animal sounds. We reached the trailhead late that afternoon and immediately contacted the Kentucky State Police, who launched a comprehensive search and rescue operation involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and over 40 trained personnel. The search continued for 6 days and covered nearly 50 square miles of mountainous terrain, but no trace of Marcus Chen or Rebecca Morrison was ever found. The official report concluded that both individuals had probably fallen victim to accidents or animal attacks, and that their bodies had been scattered by scavengers or washed away by recent heavy rains. However, 3 weeks after the official search was called off, I returned to the area alone to conduct my own investigation. I was convinced that something more than accidents or animal attacks was responsible for the disappearances, and I wanted to examine the area more thoroughly than had been possible during the emergency search operation. What I found during that solo investigation changed my understanding of what was happening in these mountains. Hidden in a steep ravine about 3 miles from where Marcus and Rebecca had disappeared, I discovered a large cave system that showed clear evidence of human habitation. The caves had been modified with hand-built stone walls, wooden platforms, and crude furniture constructed from logs and salvaged materials. More disturbing were the collections of personal items that filled several of the cave chambers. There were dozens of backpacks, sleeping bags, hunting rifles, and camping equipment that clearly belonged to different people and spanned multiple decades. Many of the items were arranged in neat displays as if someone was maintaining a museum of their victims' possessions. I found driver licenses, credit cards, and hunting licenses with photographs of people I did not recognize, dating back to the 1980s. The most horrifying discovery was in the deepest chamber of the cave system, where I found what can only be described as a workshop for identity theft on a massive scale. There were detailed files on hundreds of individuals, including photocopies of identification documents, handwriting samples, and personal information that could be used to assume someone's identity. The files were organized by physical characteristics such as height, weight, hair color, and facial features, as if someone was cataloging people based on their suitability for impersonation. I also found evidence of sophisticated disguise materials, including prosthetic facial features, hair pieces, and clothing that had been altered to match specific individuals. It became clear that someone was using the remote cave system as a base for capturing hikers and hunters, studying their identities and then assuming their lives by using their personal information and physical appearance. When I examined the files more closely, I found detailed information about Marcus Chen and Rebecca Morrison, including photographs that had been taken during our hunting trip without our knowledge. The files contained their home addresses, employment information, family details, and financial records that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance and research. I photographed everything I could and left the cave system as quickly as possible, knowing that whoever was responsible for these disappearances would probably return soon. When I reported my findings to the state police, they initially treated me as a person of interest in the disappearances, suspecting that I might be involved in some kind of elaborate insurance fraud scheme. It took weeks of investigation and corroboration before they accepted that I had uncovered evidence of a much larger criminal operation. The subsequent investigation revealed that the cave system had been used as a base for identity theft and murder for over 20 years. The individual responsible was a former military intelligence specialist named William Garrett, who had been presumed dead since 2001 but had actually been living in the mountains and perfecting techniques for stealing identities from people who would not be missed for several days or weeks. Garrett had been systematically targeting solo hikers, small hunting groups, and researchers who worked in remote areas, capturing them and using sophisticated interrogation techniques to extract personal information before eliminating them. He would then use their identities to access bank accounts, sell property, and create false documentation that allowed him to assume multiple identities as needed. The arrest and trial of William Garrett made national news as one of the most extensive identity theft and serial murder cases in Kentucky history. Evidence found in the cave system linked him to over 30 disappearances spanning 2 decades, including several cases that had been classified as accidental deaths or animal attacks. Marcus Chen and Rebecca Morrison were never found, and I believe their identities are still being used by accomplices who were never identified or captured. The mountains that had been my livelihood and my passion became a reminder of how evil can hide in the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places. I sold the outfitting business and moved back to Montana, where I now work as a ranch hand and try not to think about the hunters who trusted me to keep them safe in country that I thought I understood. The Kentucky mountains will always be home to something more dangerous than bears, venomous snakes, or treacherous terrain. Sometimes the greatest predators are the ones who have learned to wear the faces and live the lives of their victims. I moved to North Carolina to help maintain the Appalachian Trail because I wanted to help people. Trail angels are supposed to provide aid and comfort to hikers. I found out some angels are actually something much darker. My name is Isabella Fernandez. I am 35 years old, and I relocated to the Blue Ridge Mountains from Phoenix, Arizona in 2019 after burning out from 10 years as an EMT in urban emergency services. I thought that working as a trail maintenance coordinator and volunteer trail angel would be the perfect way to use my medical skills while finding peace in the wilderness I had always loved. Trail angels are volunteers who provide assistance to long-distance hikers, offering everything from rides to grocery stores and hot meals to emergency medical care and safe places to rest. The community of trail angels along the Appalachian Trail is legendary for their generosity and dedication to helping strangers complete one of the most challenging hiking adventures in North America. When I moved to North Carolina, I was eager to become part of this tradition of selfless service. I rented a small cabin about 5 miles from the trail in the Nantahala National Forest and began volunteering with the Carolina Mountain Club, which coordinates trail maintenance and hiker services throughout the region. My EMT background made me particularly valuable for providing medical assistance to hikers who were dealing with everything from blisters and dehydration to more serious injuries like broken bones or severe allergic reactions. For the first year, the work was exactly what I had hoped it would be. I spent my days clearing fallen trees from trail sections, repairing damaged bridges and shelters, and maintaining the network of emergency supply caches that provided life-saving resources for hikers in distress. Several times each month, I would receive calls from other trail angels or park rangers requesting medical assistance for hikers who needed more care than basic first aid could provide. The hiking community was everything I had expected it to be: supportive, grateful, and filled with people who had chosen to challenge themselves in the wilderness rather than pursuing material success in urban environments. I felt like I was finally using my skills to make a meaningful difference in people's lives, and I was happier than I had been in years. The first sign that something was wrong came in early spring of 2020, when I started receiving requests for assistance that seemed slightly off compared to my previous experiences. Instead of calls from park rangers or established trail angels, I was being contacted by people who claimed to represent informal hiker assistance networks that I had never heard of before. The requests always involved solo hikers who were supposedly in distress at remote locations well off the main trail. The people making the requests would provide detailed information about the hiker's condition and exact GPS coordinates, but they would insist that I come alone, because the hiker was in a psychologically fragile state and would be overwhelmed by too many rescuers. They also emphasized that these were unofficial rescues that should not be reported to park authorities because the hikers were trying to avoid legal complications related to unpermitted camping or other minor violations. Initially, I assumed these requests were coming from an underground network of hikers who were trying to help each other while avoiding bureaucratic complications with park regulations. I responded to 3 of these calls during March and April, hiking to remote locations with my medical equipment to assist hikers who were supposedly suffering from severe dehydration, altitude sickness, or injuries from falls. In each case, when I arrived at the specified coordinates, I found a hiker who matched the description I had been given, exhibiting the symptoms I had been told to expect. However, there were subtle details about these encounters that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The hikers seemed unusually disoriented and confused, often unable to provide clear accounts of how they had become injured or lost. They were also carrying gear that was either inadequate for the conditions they claimed to have been hiking in, or was in much better condition than would be expected after the ordeals they described. Most disturbing was that all 3 hikers insisted on being treated at the remote locations rather than being evacuated to proper medical facilities, even when their conditions seemed to require more advanced care than I could provide in the field. They claimed to have philosophical objections to traditional medical institutions and said they preferred to rely on natural healing methods and the assistance of the hiking community. The pattern became clear during my 4th response call in late April. I was contacted by someone claiming that a female hiker in her 20s had fallen from a cliff and was suffering from a possible spinal injury in a location that required a 2-hour hike through dense forest to reach. When I arrived at the coordinates, I found the hiker exactly as described, lying on a makeshift stretcher and displaying symptoms consistent with serious back trauma. However, while I was conducting my medical assessment, I noticed that we were being observed by at least 3 other people who were positioned in concealed locations around our position. When I called out to them and asked for their assistance, they disappeared into the forest without responding. The injured hiker became extremely agitated when I mentioned seeing other people and insisted that we were completely alone in the area. During my treatment of her injuries, the hiker made several statements that convinced me something was seriously wrong with the situation. She referred to other trail angels who had assisted her in recent weeks, describing them in ways that suggested she had been moved between different locations and treated by multiple people. She also mentioned being given medications that had made her feel confused and disoriented, and she asked me whether the people who had been helping her were really trying to help or were using her for some other purpose. When I suggested that we needed to evacuate her to a hospital for proper treatment of her spinal injury, she became panicked and begged me not to contact any official authorities. She said that the people who had been taking care of her had warned her that involving park rangers or medical personnel would result in serious legal consequences for everyone involved. She claimed that she and several other hikers were being protected by a network of trail angels who were helping them avoid prosecution for various legal problems they were facing. I realized then that I was not responding to legitimate medical emergencies but was being used as part of a system that was holding people against their will under the guise of providing assistance. The injured hiker was not a victim of an accident, but was being kept in a weakened and dependent state by people who were using her need for medical care to control her movements and decisions. I told the hiker that I needed to return to my vehicle to get additional medical supplies, but instead I hiked directly to the nearest location with cell phone coverage and contacted the North Carolina State Police. I provided them with detailed information about the location where I had found the hiker and described the suspicious circumstances surrounding the apparent rescue operation. When state police and park rangers responded to the location later that evening, they found the area completely abandoned. There was evidence that several people had been camping in the area for an extended period, including temporary shelters, cooking equipment, and medical supplies, but no trace of the injured hiker or the people who had been watching us during my treatment. The investigation that followed revealed that I had uncovered a human trafficking operation that was using the reputation and network of legitimate trail angels to identify and capture vulnerable hikers. The operation specifically targeted solo hikers who were estranged from their families, had histories of mental health issues, or were traveling under circumstances that made them unlikely to be reported missing quickly. The traffickers were using fake emergency calls to lure legitimate trail angels to remote locations where they could be evaluated as potential victims or unwitting accomplices. Those who asked too many questions or seemed likely to report suspicious activities were discouraged from further involvement through intimidation or bureaucratic obstacles. Those who were willing to provide services without asking questions were gradually drawn deeper into the operation until they became complicit in the trafficking activities. According to the investigation, the operation had been active for over 2 years, and had successfully trafficked at least 12 hikers who had been reported missing along various sections of the Appalachian Trail. The victims were being held in remote facilities throughout the region and were being used for forced labor, sexual exploitation, or other criminal activities that took advantage of their isolation and dependence on their captors for basic survival needs. The people running the operation had extensive knowledge of hiking culture, trail angel networks, and wilderness survival techniques that allowed them to operate effectively in remote areas where law enforcement had limited presence. They had also infiltrated legitimate hiking organizations and online communities, where they gathered intelligence about potential victims and identified trail angels who could be manipulated into providing assistance. Several arrests were made during coordinated raids on suspected trafficking locations throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. But many of the victims were never recovered and are still listed as missing persons. The investigation also revealed connections to similar operations in other states along the Appalachian Trail corridor, suggesting that this was part of a much larger criminal network that was using America's wilderness areas as hunting grounds for human traffickers. I testified in the trials of the people who were arrested, but the experience fundamentally changed my relationship with the hiking community in wilderness areas that I had thought were safe refuges from urban violence. I moved back to Arizona within 6 months of the investigation and returned to working as an urban EMT, where the dangers are at least visible and predictable. The trail angel community along the Appalachian Trail has implemented new safety protocols and verification procedures to prevent similar infiltration by criminal organizations, but the damage has been done. Hikers who once trusted that any offer of assistance came from genuine Good Samaritans now must carefully evaluate whether the people offering help might have ulterior motives. The wilderness areas that attract people seeking peace and spiritual renewal have been contaminated by predators who understand that our desire to trust and help each other can be weaponized against us. Sometimes the greatest danger in the wilderness is not bears, snakes, or natural hazards, but the people who wear the masks of helpers and protectors while hunting for victims who will never be found.